Good morning and welcome, friends, to our Sunday meeting, which takes place at 11 a.m. every Sunday. The platform discusses a particular topic presented by a student of Theosophy, followed by questions and answers. On the first and third Sundays of the month, we're studying The Key by H.P. Blavatsky. Next week is a special day. We will be celebrating the life and work of Mr. Crosby. The gift to the world sent especially to the Western world by the Masters of Wisdom in the 19th century was and is still available in the books that H.P.B. wrote for the future generations to come. One of the gifts she discusses in the Secret Doctrine, it being in two component parts, cosmogenesis and anthropogenesis, is the sevenfold division of man, and how the triad, which is of the essence of the spiritual progenitors of mankind, goes from life to life, making the philosophy of karma and reincarnation a necessity for humanity to move forward in the developmental stages of the spiritual, mental, and physical that happens through the cycle of regeneration. The fundamental principles of the component parts of the human being is given, and this is necessary because it enables humanity to know who and what they are, what their purpose is on earth, and what is the highest achievable possible, and how do we get on the path in achieving this. The mind then is part of that higher triad which goes from life to life, which will be today's talk. The declaration states that the policy of this lodge is independent devotion to the cause of Theosophy without professing attachment to any theosophical organization. It is loyal to the great founders of the theosophical movement, but does not concern itself with dissensions or differences of individual opinion. The work it has on hand and the end it keeps in view are too absorbing and too lofty to leave it the time or inclination to take part in side issues. That work and that end is the dissemination of the fundamental principles of the philosophy of Theosophy and the exemplification in practice of those principles through a truer realization of the self, a profounder conviction of universal brotherhood. It holds that the unassailable basis for union among Theosophists, wherever and however situated, is similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching, and therefore has neither constitution, bylaws, nor officers, the sole bond between its associates being that basis. And it aims to disseminate this idea among Theosophists in the furtherance of unity. It regards as Theosophists all who are engaged in the true service of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, sex, condition, or organization. And it welcomes to its association all those who are in accord with its declared purposes, and who desire to fit themselves to study and otherwise to be the better able to help and teach others. The true Theosophist belongs to no cult or sect, yet belongs to each and all. The reading today comes from the Upanishads and the Tao Te Ching. This is from Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, Liberation. Thus far of him who's under desire, Now as to him who is free from desire, who is beyond desire, who has gained his desire, for whom the soul is his desire, from him the life powers do not depart. Growing one with the eternal, he enters into the eternal. There is this verse, when all desires that were hid in the heart are let go, the mortal becomes immortal and reaches the eternal. And like as the slope of a snake lies lifeless, cast forth upon an anthill, so lies his body. When the spirit of man rises up bodiless and immortal, as the life, as the eternal, as the radiance. And now today's talk, manas in the fifth round.
Welcome, friends. I have some handouts for the folks here, just some diagrams to refer to. So I'm gonna pass it and I'll put it up briefly so that our folks online can refer to it. Oops, that's a lie. The Upanishad said growing with eternity, and that's essentially what's going to be the underlying theme of this. First we'll talk about the rounds, get a little understanding, and then how manas evolved and continues to evolve through our stage of humanity and onwards. And this one isn't dark. Basically, this is the globes of a chain of globes like the Earth, and this is the path of evolution that we're going to trace out, and this will end up corresponding with this other diagram, and these are in the Secret Doctrine. This one's on page 38 of the second volume, and I think this is like 171 or something in the first. But I'll flesh this out in a minute. But basically we'll start with what are the rounds? What are the rounds and how do they relate to our evolution so we can understand where we are in the grand scheme of evolution and where we're headed. So, everything we know that we see, we feel, we understand, it's all composed of life. And life is ever evolving. And life, the evolution of life proceeds on our chain of the globes, the Earth chain, on 7 bodies from the 1st to the 7th and 7 rounds or cycles. So every time the life wave goes through the series, it constitutes 1 round. And according to the ancient doctrine, we are in the 4th round. And furthermore, these cycles are subdivided into races, and we are in the 5th subrace of the 4th round. So when we talk about manas in the 5th round, we're going to be talking about where our evolution is headed and what, if we see any of that sort of efflorescence beginning in our cycle and within ourselves, possibly. So our Earth is a visible representation of the, of the other globes that are invisible to our physical sight, but they are fellow globes, and each of its sort of lords or principles has to live, as have the others, through these 7 rounds. During the first 3, the globe forms and consolidates. During the fourth, it settles and hardens, and during the last three, it gradually returns to its first ethereal form. It's spiritualized, so to say. So, from spirit, descending into matter, reaching the most physical, material level, and gradually ascending back up to spirit. That's what happens with each round. There's this evolution. First an involution into matter, and an evolution out of matter to spirit. But how does that relate to our principles and our evolution, and especially manas being the mind, the thinking principle, the very sort of link between the lower kingdoms and the higher kingdoms. So humanity develops fully only in the fourth round, our present round. Up to the fourth life cycle, humanity is referred to as humanity only for lack of a more appropriate term. HPB says, like the grub which becomes chrysalis and butterfly, man, or rather that which becomes man, passes through all the forms and kingdoms during the first round, and through all the human shapes during the following two rounds. Arrived at our earth at the commencement of the fourth in the present series of life cycles and races, man is the first form that appears thereon, being preceded only by the mineral and the vegetable kingdoms. Even the latter having to develop and continue its further evolution through man. During the 3 rounds to come, 4, 5, 6, and 7, humanity, like the globe on which it lives, will ever be tending to reassume its primeval form, that of a Dian Chohanic host. Man tends to become a god, then God, like every atom in the universe. So man becomes a god, then becomes God, as does every atom in the universe, HPB says. Every atom is evolving. There's no portion that's left out. Beginning as early as the second round, evolution proceeds already on quite a different plan. It's only during the first round that heavenly man becomes a human being on globe A, re-becomes a mineral, a plant, an animal on globe B and C, etc. The process changes entirely from the second round. Every life cycle on globe D, our Earth, is composed of 7 root races. They commence with the ethereal and end with the spiritual on the double line of physical and moral evolution. So we always have to keep this in mind, that it's a double evolution. It's not just physical, it's not just mental and moral, it's both. One cannot happen without the other, because our principles are intertwined. They all relate to each other. From the beginning of the terrestrial round to its close, there's this double line. One is a planetary round, the other the globe, or the terrestrial. Every round brings about a new development and an even entire change in the mental, psychic, spiritual, and physical constituents of man. All these principles evoluting on an ever-ascending scale. Thence it follows that persons who, like Confucius and Plato, belonged psychically, mentally, and spiritually to the higher planes of evolution, were in our 4th round, as the average man will be in the 5th round, whose mankind is destined to find itself on this scale of evolution immensely higher than is our present humanity. Similarly, Gautama Buddha, wisdom incarnate, was still higher and greater than all the men we have mentioned, who are called 5th rounders, while Buddha and Shankaracharya are termed 6th rounders, allegorically. Thence again the concealed wisdom of the remark that, quote, a few drops of rain do not make the monsoon, though they presage it. So as our principles evolve, as was said, a physical and moral evolution, we can see that beings like the Buddha with the highest ethics, constitutes a more advanced stage of evolution than we currently find humanity in. So there is much hope that humanity will become Buddha-like as we evolve. But because we are self-conscious and we have the principle of mind and therefore free will and can make choices, when we don't always make choices in our best interest, we can create painful karma for ourselves. As we can see, humanity rarely learns its lesson the first time around, but ends up making the same mistakes over and over again. But to avoid doing that, to help on our own evolution and that of the entire mass of egos on the planet, understanding this philosophy, understanding where we've been and where we're going, we can change that trajectory so that we bring about a higher stage more rapidly. We don't have to waste time working out the problems of desire over and over again to the extent that perhaps we have. So to return to evolution, when the first class or hierarchy of monads incarnate upon the first globe in the lowest kingdom, the elemental, the mineral, the plant, the animal, the human, the result is that it is only the first class of monads which attains to the human stage of development during the first round, since the second class, arriving later, has not had time to reach it. These are called life waves, and HPB says they come in this regular succession. And that's how the planet, the globe, gets populated with monads, and that's where we're creating our experiences and learning. So the second class, arriving later, reaches that stage of humanity a little later than the first wave. So the monads, we'll say, of class 2 reach the incipient human stage only in the second round, and so on, the third and the fourth, up to the middle of the fourth round. So we've gone around 1, 2, 3. The midpoint of the fourth, we would say, is globe D. And at this point, the human stage, and the door to the human kingdom is said closes. There's a definite number of human monads associated with each chain, chain of globes. So monads in the human stage of development is complete. And then the beings that have not reached the human stage, by that point, owing to the evolution of humanity itself, find at the close of the seventh and that they will reach the human stage only at the close of the seventh and last round. They will therefore not be men on this chain, but they will form the humanity of a future Manvantara, a great period of evolution, and be rewarded by becoming men on a higher chain altogether, thus receiving their karmic compensation. So to summarize, we'll put the monads into three brief categories, 3 great classes. And this is from the Secret Doctrine, pages 170 to 175. Whoa. So the most developed monads is the monadic host is developed. We put into 3 categories. So the most developed, and then whose function it is to pass in the first round through the whole triple cycle of mineral, vegetable, and animal in their most ethereal, filmy, and rudimentary forms in order to clothe themselves in and assimilate the nature of the newly formed chain. They are those who first reach the human form, if there can be any form in the realm of the almost subjective on globe A in the first round. It is they, therefore, who lead and represent the human element during the second and third rounds. and finally evolve their shadows at the beginning of the fourth for the second class, who come next. Those monads who are first to reach the human stage during the first 3.5 rounds to become men. So I guess we'll say men during the first 3.5. First 3.5 rounds. And the third, the monads which, achieving this stage later, which will not reach by reason of karmic impediments the human stage at all during this cycle or round. So this would be everything below us: animal kingdom, plant, mineral, elemental. And they will reach the human stage, just not during this round. They have to wait for the next manvantara. So the most developed are sort of like those who achieved the human stage very early on and have been through all the stages we are now in. We could say they are like teachers of humanity. And then men is the second class, and then everything below that. Those are the 3 classes, you could say. Okay, so now to talk about the dual aspect of evolution, the physical and the moral, or the mental. Now, the evolution of the external body or form around the astral is produced by terrestrial forces, just as in the case of the lower kingdoms. But the evolution of the internal or real man is purely spiritual. It is now no more a passage of the impersonal monad through many and various forms of matter, endowed at best with instinct and consciousness on quite a different plane, as in the case of external evolution, but a journey of the pilgrim soul, each monad, through various states of not only matter, but self-consciousness and self-perception. The monad thus emerges from its state of spiritual and intellectual unconsciousness, and it gets direct into the plane of mentality. But there is no plane in the whole universe with a wider margin or a wider field of action and an almost endless gradation of perceptive and apperceptive qualities than this plane, which has in its turn an appropriate smaller plane for every form, from the mineral up to the time when the monad blossoms forth by evolution into the divine monad. But all the time it is still one and ever the same monad, differing only in its incarnations throughout its ever-succeeding cycles of partial or total obscuration of spirit, or the partial or total obscuration of matter, 2 polar antitheses, and it ascends into the realms of mental spirituality, or descends into the depths of materiality. So that kind of says it all, but it's a lot to think about. So the mental plane has the widest possible range of gradations because our thoughts create vibration, and vibration on a scale, on a ladder of being. There's fluctuations. Probably beings might, don't stay. Nothing stays static, but it's this constantly evolving, changing evolution. As said, there's periods of obscuration of form, there's obscuration of spirituality, but through all this, we become, as was said, a god, then gods. So far, up to the 4th round, and even to the later part of the 3rd race in the 4th round, if the ever-changing forms that clothe the monad during the first 3 rounds and the first 2.5 races of the present one can be given that misleading name, is so far only an animal intellectuality. It is only in the actual midway round, which is the one that we're in, and why HPB says that this is a transition time. It's very important to our development. that he develops in himself entirely the fourth principle, or desire, as a fit vehicle for the fifth. Fifth principle being manas, or mind. But manas will be relatively fully developed only in the following round, when it will have an opportunity of becoming entirely divine until the end of the rounds. So basically, what we have now is sort of the beginning of mind. We've developed that part of mind that most closely corresponds with the principle of the fourth. The fourth principle is desire. So desire in mind becomes lower mind. It becomes intellectuality. Intellect, it's mind, but not in its full capacity like a Buddha, where it's fully like enlightened, but it's tinged with desires. And thus, because those desires are related to this most lowest point of physical material development, they end up being attached to, environment, physical materiality. So what we think of as like the highest level of evolution of, great people we can think of and so forth, it's just a glimmer on this plane. We still have so much more evolution to go. And instead of thinking, where can humanity go from here? We're as smart as we've ever been, and we've developed all this great stuff. We tend to humanity has this hubris, think that we're so wonderful, and we are, because we're gods in the making, but we have to realize there's a lot of making that has to happen between here and there. Esoteric philosophy, it's said in the Secret Doctrine, admits neither good nor evil per se as existing independently in nature. We don't need to look at it as, desire is bad per se. It's a stage. They exist independently in nature, and the cause for both is found, as regards the cosmos, in the necessity of there being duality, the necessity of contrast and of contraries with respect to man in his nature, his ignorance and his passions. There is no devil, quote unquote, or utterly depraved, as there are no angels absolutely perfect, though there may be spirits of light and spirits of darkness. Thus, Lucifer, the spirit of intellectual enlightenment and freedom of thought, is metaphorically the guiding beacon, and which helps man to find his way through the rocks and sandbanks of life. For Lucifer, too, is the Logos in his highest, and the adversary in his lowest aspect, both of which are reflected in our egos. So we have to realize that we're a combination of principles and desires, motivations in this course of evolution. So now we come to an important point with regard to this double evolution of the human race. The Sons of Wisdom, or the spiritual Dhyanis, the Dhyan Chohans, as was mentioned, in the course of evolution had become intellectual through their contact with matter, because they had already reached during previous cycles of incarnation that degree of intellect which enabled them to become independent self-conscious entities on this plane of matter. They were reborn only by reason of karmic effects. They entered those who were ready, quote unquote. And Madame Blavatsky talks about the monads in that life wave. The ones who reached the human stage entered the forms that were ready. But because it's all evolution, not all were ready at the same time. Thus, some of humanity, it's said in the Secret Doctrine, only got a spark. And that's why we see that there's a great difference in humanity between the most evolved and the least evolved. It's not that they're not capable of the least developed aren't capable. It's just they haven't reached that level of development yet. Everything needs its time to develop. But the monads, the essences, intelligences, and conscious spirits, entities seeking to become still more conscious by uniting with developed matter. And that's hence the pilgrimage we're on. But their egos, or manas, born of Mahat, they are called Manasaputra. They had to pass through earthly human experiences to become all-wise and to be able to start on the returning ascending cycle. Just to illustrate that, what we've been talking about, that different waves go through, and it is these Manasaputra, sons of Mahat, who are more fully developed than we are, who helped lend us our mind principle. They're the ones in the Secret Doctrine who lit up mind and helped the ones coming behind. So in that analogy, we have to think, well, where are we? Who are we? How can we help the wave of life below us achieve the human stage? What role do we play in this cycle? So all these principles are latent in each from his or her birth. It is not the part of evolutionary law that the fifth principle should receive its complete development before the fifth round. So essentially, we see the mind, it's lighting up, and we can use the mind principle and develop it, but it's in terms of the entire mass of humanity, it's not going to be fully developed till the next round. So even in the coming seventh race, at the close of this fourth round, while our four lower principles will be fully developed, that of Manas will only be proportionately so. This limitation refers solely to the spiritual development. The intellectual on the physical plane was reached during the fourth root race. Those who were half ready but received a spark constitute the average humanity, which has to acquire its intellectuality during the present evolution, after which they will be ready in the next for the full reception of the Manasaputra, the sons of wisdom. So she's laying out the entire, as much as she can, process of evolution and pointing to where we are. So to recapitulate briefly, the Secret Doctrine claims for man a polygenetic origin, a variety of modes of generation before humanity appears as it does to us now, and the evolution of the entire life wave, including, the animals and the minerals and the plants, are not left out, and that as science thinks the mammals preceded us, or we may have been derived from mammals, Secret Doctrine says the opposite is the case, that mammals developed after humans in this round. We can't really speak too much about other rounds, not having remembered that experience. And that's why the masters have kept this wisdom alive, and they say, we have to be careful in how we present it, because it's like pearls before swine. There's so many people that might laugh and find it ridiculous, but if it's really examined, the inherent consistency just makes so much sense, and it's incredibly logical. Okay, just to tie that up, I'm going to read one more thing. Arguing from, if man really is the microcosm of the macrocosm, then the teaching has nothing so very impossible in it, and it is but logical. For man becomes that macrocosm for the three lower kingdoms under him. Arguing from a physical standpoint, all the lower kingdoms, save the mineral, which is light itself, crystallized and immetalized, from plants to the creatures which preceded the first of mammals, all have been consolidated in their physical structures by means of the cast-off dust, quote-unquote, of those minerals, and from human matter, whether from living or dead, on which they fed and gave them their outer bodies. In other words, the matter that we aren't using doesn't disappear, it gets used in the system by other beings, and it's saying plants and animals and metals and elementals and so forth. In his turn, man grew more physical by reabsorbing into his system that which he had given out, and which became transformed in the living animal crucibles through which it had passed, owing to nature's alchemical transmutations. It goes on to say there were animals in those days that our modern naturalists have never dreamed of. There were forms that were androgen. It goes on and on and on. Evolution is an eternal cycle of becoming, we are taught, and nature never leaves an atom unused. Moreover, from the beginning of the round, all in nature tends to become man. All the impulses of the dual force of centripetal and centrifugal are directed towards one point, man. And man itself, the word, comes from MANAS, meaning mind, because men are minds. Okay. So what is mind and how does it relate to our development in the fourth and the coming fifth round? Mind is the name given to the sum of the states of consciousness grouped under thought, will, and feeling. During deep sleep, when ideation ceases on the physical plane and memory is in abeyance, because the brain, shuts down the conscious centers and the unconscious centers stay awake, thus for the time being, mind is not, because the organ through which the ego manifests itself and the memory on the material plane has ceased to function. It's because the brain is the tool of the mind, it's the organ. But even when all existence is dissolved, as in a rest period between manifestations, universal mind remains as a permanent possibility of mental action, or as that abstract absolute thought of which mind is the concrete relative manifestation. So there is always universal mind, so to speak, even if we're not exhibiting it or acting on it, doesn't mean that it's not there. The Dian Chohans are the collective hosts of spiritual beings who are the vehicle for the manifestation of the divine or universal thought and will. They are the intelligent forces that give to and enact in nature her laws, while themselves acting according to laws imposed upon them in a similar manner by still higher powers. But they are not personifications of the powers of nature, as erroneously thought. This hierarchy of spiritual beings through which the universal mind comes into action is like an army, a host, truly, by means of which the fighting power of a nation manifests itself, and which is composed of an army corps and different divisions and regiments, brigades, and so forth, each with its separate individuality or life, and its limited freedom of action and limited responsibilities, each contained in a larger individuality to which its own interests are subservient, and each containing lesser individualities in itself. So, as was said, we are the fifth root race in our first half onward on the ascending arc of the cycle, the midpoint between the first and second races. And we get that by, maybe it'll just be easier to look at this. Does this click? Well, this evolution again going from the first root race to the second to the third, down to the most material, and returning back up at a higher level ultimately of spirituality. If we're in the fifth, it can be seen that that corresponds with the same level of the second root race. And this is called the meridian of the race's ascending cycle. Re-evolution or reversion of spirituality and the gradual decrease of materiality and mere brain intellectuality. That's what characterizes the ascending cycle. Re-evolution of spirituality, gradual decrease of materiality and intellectuality. Calculating as advised, we find that during that transitional period, namely in the second half of the first spiritual ethero-astral race that corresponds similarly to where we're headed, nascent mankind was devoid of the intellectual brain element. As it was on its descending line, and as we are parallel to it on the ascending, we are therefore devoid of the spiritual element, which is now replaced with the intellectual. For, remember well, as we are in the Manasa period of our cycle of races, or in the fifth, we've crossed that meridian point of the perfect adjustment of spirit and matter, and the equilibrium between brain, intellect, and spiritual perception. So now that we're on the reascending cycle, we've achieved as much intellectuality, so to speak, on this plane as we're going to. And now we're headed towards spirituality. One important point has, however, to be borne in mind. We are only in the fourth round, and it is in the fifth that the full development of manas, or mind, as a direct ray from universal mind, mahat, a ray unimpeded by matter, will be finally reached. Nevertheless, as every subrace and nation have their cycles and stages of developmental evolution repeated on smaller scale, it must be the more so in the case of a root race. Our race, then, being the fifth root race, has, as a root race, crossed the equatorial line and is cycling onward on the spiritual side. But some of our subraces still find themselves on the shadowy, descending arc of their respective national cycles, while others, again, the oldest, having crossed their crucial point, are at the apex of spiritual development as a subrace. So remember, the race is like the majority, but there are subraces and family races, and you can break it down finer and finer. But basically what she's saying is the majority have reached this middle point and on their way up, but there are some that still haven't reached it, and there's some that have already. So when we're talking about mind, we know that when it incarnates, it manifests dual, and lower and higher mind. The lower gravitates towards the animal, material, and the higher gravitates towards buddhi and atma, the spiritual light. And the personality is what we say the mind and intellectuality is, in that it's the personality we assume from life to life, but perishes. It doesn't go with us. It doesn't survive death. Whereas the individuality, that which gravitates the higher mind, the higher principles, goes from life to life. So keeping that in mind, we'll talk a little bit about mind and manas and psychic, and then we'll open it up for questions, even though there's so much. Now, we can tell the difference between like intellectual or psychic individuality and higher, and that which is lower, just to get some marks to distinguish it. By psychic individuality, we mean that self-determining power which enables man to override circumstances. Place half a dozen animals of the same species under the same circumstances, and their actions, while not identical, will be closely similar. Place half a dozen men under the same circumstances, and their actions will be as different as their characters. That is their psychic individuality. the personality in that life. But if instead of psychic we call it the higher self-conscious will, then having been shown by the science of psychophysiology itself that will has no special organ of its own, how will the materialists connect it with molecular motion at all? And this is a little bit about, in the 1800s when they were discovering sort of mind and consciousness and how the brain worked. The phenomena of human consciousness must be regarded as activities of some other form of real being than the moving molecules of the brain. That was from Professor Ladd, and I think we all agree on that. And I think science does too. There may be some that still think you need molecules moving in the brain to equate the mind, but science is, again, progressing with us. So, mental faculties are not entities that have an existence of themselves. They are the modes of behavior and the consciousness of the mind. And the very nature of the classifying acts which lead to their being distinguished is explicable only upon the assumption that a real being called mind exists, and it is to be distinguished from other real beings known as physical molecules of the brain's nervous system. So mind really is manas, or rather, the lower mind is the lower reflection, which whenever it disconnects itself for the time being and pairs itself with kama, the desire principle, results in intellectuality. But when it disconnects itself from kama, leaving the desires behind, as the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad mentioned in the early reading, it becomes the guide of the highest mental faculties and is the organ of the free will in physical man. So when the desires are arrested and left behind, then the higher mind is freer. It's not being pulled on by the lower mind. It can ascend to some of these higher states of consciousness. It's not being tugged down to the physical. So since Theosophy and occultism postulate within each person an immortal entity, divine mind, or nous, whose pale and too often distorted reflection is what we call mind and intellect in men, virtually an entity apart from the former during every incarnation, we say that the two sources of memory are in these two principles. These two we can distinguish as the higher mind and the lower mind, kama manas, the rational but earthly physical intellect of man, encased in, bound by matter, therefore subject to the influences of the latter. The all-conscious self, which reincarnates periodically, and which is always the same, while its reflected double changes with every new incarnation and personality, is the individuality. And the individuality is that which goes from life to life. It is the noetic element, etc. And this higher ego cannot act directly on the body, as its consciousness belongs to quite another plane and the planes of ideation that the lower self does. Its action and behavior depend on its free will and choice as to whether it will gravitate more towards its parent, the Father in heaven, or the animal which informs it, the man of flesh. The higher ego, as part of the essence of the universal mind, is unconditionally omniscient on its own plane, and only potentially so in the terrestrial sphere, as it has to act solely through its alter ego, the personal self. Now, although the former is the vehicle of all knowledge of the past, the present, and the future, and although it is from this fountainhead that its double catches occasional glimpses of that which is beyond the senses of man and transmits them to the brain cells, thus making of man a seer, a prophet, yet the memory of bygone events, especially of the earthy, has its seat in the personal ego alone. No memory of a purely daily life function of a physical, egotistical, or a lower mental nature, like eating, drinking, etc., transacting business, has anything to do with the higher mind, nor has it any direct dealings on this physical plane with either our brain or our heart, for these two are organs of a higher power than the personality. Thus it stands to reason that the memory of such like events must first be awakened in that organ, which was the first to induce the action remembered afterwards and conveyed to our sense thought. In other words, how we perceive and how we use our mind can affect how we perceive time and what we remember. Manas, being the fifth principle, is the first of the real man. It's the thinking principle and not the product of the brain. Manas is the seer. If the connection between Manas and the brain is broken, the person is not able to cognize. The organs of the body cognize nothing. Manas is divided into its upper and lower. In beings like Buddha or Jesus, the Manas is fully developed. And this is like the permanent individuality. And then let me just tie this up and then we'll open it up for questions. The course of evolution developed the lower principles and produced at last the form of a man with a brain of better and deeper capacity than that of any animal. But this man in form needs the fifth principle or mind, the thinking, perceiving one, to differentiate him from the animal kingdom and to confer the power of becoming self-conscious. So without the presence of the monad, evolution could not go forward. In other words, it's said that natural impulse can take us so far, but then to proceed further in our evolution, we need mind, self-consciousness, will, self-induced, and self-devised efforts. So it is the reincarnating being, or mind, Manas, the thinker, the immortal, who carries the results and values of all the different lives lived on earth. It becomes dual as soon as it is attached to a body. For the human brain is a superior organism, and Manas uses it to reason from premises to conclusions. And that's what differentiates us from animals. But mind is omniscient on its own plane, and as such, it doesn't need to go from premises to conclusions. On its own plane, it knows, it is knowledge, and that is eternally out there. It's not the property of one or another mind. It's if the mind is developed enough to raise consciousness to be in contact with that level. So beings like Buddha and so forth, they're not just like an exception to the rule. They're ones who, as was said, like the drops that presage the monsoon, they are those who are ahead of us in evolution and have made that connection with the higher mind. In Manas, the thoughts of all our lives are stored. That is to say, in any one life, the sum total of thoughts underlying all the acts of the lifetime will be of one character in general. And so, like, someone who is just focused on business, that might be a certain character. An artist, that might be another character, and so on. In all these, the total quantity of life thoughts makes up the stream or thread of a life's meditation, that upon which the heart was set, and it is stored in Manas, to be brought out again at any time in whatever life the brain and bodily events are similar to those used in engendering that class of thoughts. It is Manas which sees the objects presented to it by the bodily organs and the actual organs within. When the eye When the open eye receives a picture on the retina, the whole scene is turned into vibrations in the optic nerves, which disappear into the brain, where Manas is enabled to perceive them as an idea. And so on with all the organs. And thus the connection between the body and Manas is part of the natural course of evolution, but if we let it, the body rule the mind, then we will not evolve to the higher, using the higher mind. In fact, it interferes with the action of the higher Manas, because just at the present point of evolution, desire and all corresponding powers, faculties, and senses are the most highly developed, thus obscuring, as it were, the white light of the spiritual side of Manas. So we'll end there, and that was as best a picture as a student could do of like where we are in evolution, where we're headed, and enough about mind to give us the sense of where we need to go with it and where we need to adjust and inhibit some of its functions to move forward. Sorry, that was really long. Appreciate your patience. Yeah, Herb.
You talked about the higher mind being eternally out there. How does that relate to the common expression of instinct? Trust your instinct. Trust your inner perception.
Well, okay, the question is, if higher mind is out there, how does that relate to instinct and trust your instincts? Well, for sure, it's not that we are devoid of any of that knowledge. Instinct is a manifestation of the lower mind. Animals, in fact, have instinct, and it's their inherent wisdom. And if they follow it precisely, that's part of karmic law. It's part of they're just living how, they don't make self-conscious decisions right or wrong. They just kind of do what they do. And in that case, instinct has a good connotation. But it's also said that intuition, which we find in man and higher beings, is direct perception of truth. And there's no need to use instinct, because instinct can get us only so far. But needing knowledge, needing higher mind, needing the wisdom of all our past and our potential future, which exists on those higher planes, intuition is said it's a direct pipeline to perception of truth. So the student would encourage one to develop one's intuition and not rely on instinct. Instinct can benefit us when the mind shuts down in fight or flight, but it's not what's going to get us to higher realms of consciousness or help us in navigating higher planes, where we have to understand ourselves and the workings of our mind so carefully and so precisely. It's just not the right tool for the job, so to speak.
So, okay, maybe I should have used the word intuition, would have tied in with what you said. So intuition starts from within, right?
Yeah, and access to mind and higher mind is also from within. That's the direction.
The imagination, can you also touch on that?
Yeah, Blavatsky does touch on imagination. She says it's the kingly faculty, because basically if we can imagine it, it's real. She says, a rope in a dream is just a rope, but it's more than just a rope. Not only because of its symbolism, but because if we can think of it, we're using thought. That is a type of material. It's a type of matter that we don't think of as matter, but to higher planes of consciousness, it's just a more subtle plane of matter. And so it is an assemblage of some creation that we've made, and we're responsible for it. So we create our reality, and using our imagination could radically change our reality if we can imagine what it would be like for all people to achieve their creative potential. If we could imagine all people being, all their physical needs being met, but also expressing everybody has unique gifts that they brought with them from life to life. And everyone knows when they have a moment of achieving something, how satisfying that is, and how it feels like there's a whole world of possibility. Imagine if everybody felt like that. It just, wow, what a world we could live in. There's plenty of resources. There's no reason for people to suffer the way they do. It doesn't have to be one person survives at the expense of another. It could, if we all helped each other, and it sounds, like a social model, but it's based on universal law that no atom is left out of the plans of the universe or out of evolution. Brotherhood, unity, that it could just be so incredible. We could, heights we can't even imagine, or we should try to imagine.
HPV actually says that our instinct doesn't work anymore because of the lower mind. The lower mind being attached to desire, it camouflages its inner coherence. In the animals, it works perfectly well, but in us it doesn't do so anymore. But then we did have it, we just lost it.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And if I may make another comment, this was about Manas in the 5th round. Where exactly are we going in the 5th round? You said that it's going to fully develop itself, but in this round you said also that we have already gone beyond the middle point and we are now ascending towards the spirituality. How can that possibly take place without the higher mind being functional?
Well, there are cycles within cycles, and because we are moving on an ascending arc, we've reached the midpoint of materiality.
No, it's not materiality. It has now...
That's also true.
The spirituality and materiality has found what? Equilibrium. You said it. You read it.
Okay. Well, the student's understanding is that we need to, exercise it, exercise mind and develop it through self-induced and self-devised efforts as much as we can, because as we, it's when there's no material, when we're becoming less material, it's the mind that's going to guide our evolution, and it's being partially, it's like, there's no principle that's never being worked on, but it's not fully, it's like the flower isn't fully in bloom until its season comes about, but it's still, there's still growth going on within the bud, even though you can't see it. So even though it's not going to be fully, mind isn't going to be fully developed until the next round, still it's the transition point away from the lower principles and materiality towards the higher principles and less materiality. And because we have mind,
well, she also tells us that if you use your intellectual mind at the expense of your spiritual one, the other side is stunted, that you can have a giant in the field of science, for instance, or medicine, or whatever, but if it is at the expense of the spiritual aspect of your mind, she says it's stunted, it will help you none.
It becomes like crooked, because if there's force being applied to something and it gets pulled in one direction, it ends up not going straight, it ends up going crooked, so to speak, as an analogy. So that's true. And how do we do that? the philosophy is full of guideposts, you know, meditation, trying to enact unity and brotherhood
Virtues.
in every relation,
Virtues.
the transcendental virtues. It's in all the great books, the exalted ethics of the great teachers, Buddha, Shankaracharya, Jesus, etc.
Well, we can also express those in our own lives to the degree that we can.
Exactly.
That's
To
the
the
only
degree
way
that
we
we
can-
can. And with use and exercise, it gets more and more developed.
Yeah.
So, thank you. And next week is ULT Day, which is a special meeting commemorating the life and work of Robert Crosby.
Okay, we're going to have a short break and reconvene the afternoon session on key to Theosophy, round table.